Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Midweek Program at the JC Raulston Arboretum. My name is Blake, and I'm the Education Assistant here at the Arboretum, and today we are outside the townhouse garden on the edge of our great lawn because there is a big old viburnum awabuki shindo in the background. This was one of the first plants that JC Raulston introduced back in the 1980s when he went on a plant collecting expedition to Korea. And today we've got a program for you where we've got our director, Mark Weathington, who is going to go through a bunch of the plants that we at the JC Raulston Arboretum have trialed here and introduced to the industry so that you have access to these plants in your own garden so that we can make the world a much more beautiful and diverse place. Those of you joining us on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, and feel free to leave a comment down below. And with the announcements out of the way, I can pass things over to Mark to tell us about the JC Raulston introduction plants.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about JC Raulston Arboretum plant introductions. And that's a trickier thing than you might think. What is a JC Raulston Arboretum introduction? You know, there's a lot of different ways to look at introductions. There are obvious ones. You mentioned the Chindo viburnum that's up behind us as an introduction, and that's one that JC Raulston collected in 1985 in Korea and brought back and put that name on it and distributed it, and it's in the trade now. It is definitely a JC Raulston Arboretum introduction, and we're going to talk about some more of those. But then there are also plants that we've been given by people who are never going to get those plants into any kind of nursery production. They're just shared with us, and they may already have a name on them, but nobody else would necessarily know them, and we introduce them to the nursery industry and get those plants out wider. Is that our introduction? Well, not really, because it's somebody else's plant. And then there are plants we go explore, and sometimes there are plants that are not in the U.S., not in the nursery industry, and we collect them in the wild and we grow them out and we evaluate them, and we may not put a cultivar name on it, but we share this plant through things like our Southeastern Plant Symposium auction and things like that. We share it, and some could say we introduced that plant to North American cultivation, but again, we don't necessarily look at that. We don't count that as a JC Raulston Arboretum introduction. We'll sometimes say we introduced it to cultivation, but here we're really talking about plants that we have named and put out there. So let's jump into and talk about plants. People ask why new plants, and there's a lot of reasons, but the truth of the matter is, for our work in extension and helping grow the nursery industry, new plants are important. They drive the excitement for consumers. They get people out to nurseries and buying plants. So we've named and introduced just a ton of plants, and a lot of that is to bring in something different, but also sometimes something superior to what's out there. And this is kind of a running list of plant introductions, and actually it's probably missing a few because we haven't always been good at really tracking what's our introduction, what is not. But the ones in red on this list are native plants. I was doing a talk for a group of nurserymen and native plant enthusiasts. We were getting together and talking about how to move more natives into the nursery industry and production and get them into landscapes. And I had this slide of our introductions, and I started, kind of highlighting the ones that were native. And, I was surprised. Nearly a third of our introductions are native plants. And that's without us intentionally going after native plants. It's just there are some great ones that are out there, and even more that we wouldn't count in this list because we didn't introduce them ourselves, but we did introduce them to the nursery industry and got them into broader cultivation. So the biggest ones are our redbuds that we've introduced jointly with former director Denny Werner. And there are just a lot of really, really good redbuds that are out there that we've introduced, but also other people. The newest series, the one that's brand new, is this Garden Gems series. And here you can see Garden Gems Amethyst Falls, which is a weeping dwarf, small-leafed purple foliage plant. Flowers heavily, really a nice plant. And unlike some of our earlier weeping introductions that I'll show in a second, which were very strict weepers, they go straight down unless you really work with them. Amethyst Falls is a little bit more graceful and wider, but still on a dwarf plant, so it doesn't get too big. Because of the small leaves, the purple lasts longer than a lot of other purple-leafed trees and shrubs here in the Southeast. So we really like that. Will it last all summer? No, but it's better than some of the other ones. One that I am really, really excited about, a new one, is this one called Gilded Hearts. And I actually went and took a picture of it today and didn't get a chance to insert it in this talk with the whole plant. This is an upright, kind of your more typical form of redbud, kind of a pretty nice tight head on it, but it's a gold leaf form of the southwestern form, the Texensis type, the Texas type, which has a thicker, glossier leaf, a little bit more rounded than heart-shaped leaf. And we have found this to just be an excellent plant for full sun. It just glows in the sun, and that color holds all summer through. Really, really like this plant a lot. And it's a lot tougher than some of the other gold-leafed ones, which have been fantastic as well. Hearts of Gold, not a JC Raulston introduction, but it is an introduction from a former employee from the JC Raulston, John Rothling, which is another great one. Garden Gems Emerald, this in the Garden Gem series, again, another small leaf dwarf redbud. This one just is really dark green leaves, again, smaller and a little bit thicker textured than others. Fantastic plant. Been watching it for a decade. It takes these plants a decade before they get introduced. And it's every year kind of, out of this whole breeding plan, you whittle down a few. First year, once they start flowering and you start seeing form and shape, it's easy. You get rid of a whole bunch of them. And then every year as you go and you start whittling it down to the one, it gets harder and harder and harder. Is this one better than this one? Is it, functionally identical? Which one do you actually go with? You always, this is when you hope for a cold winter, a wet winter, a dry summer, a late freeze, whatever, just to try to really put some stress on the plants. I will say, I showed Garden Gems Emerald and Garden Gems Amethyst Falls. There is also Garden Gems Amethyst, which is like this emerald, dwarf, small-leafed, red foliage, but not weeping. So there's a whole series of the Garden Gems and more to come, actually. So keep an eye out. One of the ones that's been really getting the greatest amount of publicity in recent years is Flamethrower Redbud. One of the only plants my wife has ever requested for the garden. So, it's got to be something that stands out because she just does not care about the plants. But Flamethrower is one that just is this constant stream of color. It comes out burgundy, goes to this coppery color, then coral, then chartreuse, and it just keeps putting out new growth all summer, so you keep getting this color. A lot of these colorful leafed trees, redbuds, they take a year or two in the landscape before they really show off. My wife had seen a Flamethrower, a mature Flamethrower, and loved it and wanted one for the garden. We planted it, and she kept telling me that's not the same plant. It's not the same plant. Finally, this year, after a couple years in the ground, she's like, "Oh yeah, now it looks like the plant that I was hoping for." So it's really amazing. And you can see it's just kind of this constant kaleidoscope of colors. Some of our earlier ones, these weepers, we really like these. Golden Falls, Ruby Falls, Whitewater. These are all really showy plants. And the Ruby Falls, I find especially, it needs 2 years in the garden before it really looks great. And these all three of these are the strict weeping types, and they really need some judicious pruning, especially when young, because they can kind of grow over themselves, and you really want to open them up a little bit. If you buy them from the nursery and you want it to go taller, you just take a young limb, and bend it up and stake it, and you can get it to grow taller, as tall as you want. You can grow it almost like a vine up over an arbor, anything like that. It's pretty easy to use that way. Or you can let it go down and cascade over a wall or a hillside or something like that, if you like. We've also I like seeing the seed pods on our red buds, but some people really dislike them. And these double flowered ones are really great for that. There's been one double flowered one in the trade for ages called Flame, which is a beautiful plant. It's got these little double rosebud pink flowers, just like you see in this picture. But Flame is this really wide spreading plant. I mean, it just goes. And pink pom-poms takes that double flower but puts it into a more upright plant, which can be easier to use in a lot of landscapes. There is also white pom-poms that we've introduced, so we have both the pink and the white double flowered ones, and they don't form seed pods, so if you don't like those bean pods, you don't have to see them. Now, those were all native ones. The other red buds I've been showing, those are plants that we've been breeding and watching for years. But sometimes there's a plant that's just been in the nursery, been in the arboretum for decades. And we watch them over time. Often they kind of, you don't think about them too much. And then somebody says, hey, have you ever noticed that one red bud over there? And you start paying attention to it. That's what kind of happened with this plant. And really that was me. I came in, started working here. And after the first couple of years, I was like, wow, what's the deal with this red bud? It is about the earliest that we have coming into flower. The Chinensis types are shrubbier and more multi-stem typically. It just is so loaded. I've never seen a red bud that flowers as heavily as this. And it just keeps flowering and keeps flowering. It is still in flower after the leaves have come out, after it's starting to form the seed pods on there. It just goes and goes. We just love this plant. And it's really become a hit with landscapers especially who like this plant because they get that long season of bloom. Now, moving away from red buds, this is another plant that we introduced with Denny Werner. Denny started his career in plant breeding as a peach breeder, edible peach breeder, and moved into the ornamentals as peaches became less of a important crop in North Carolina. But we always talked about this old peach that's nobody quite knows where its origination is, that we just call NCSU Dwarf Double Red, which is not red, it's hot pink. It's only semi-double, but it's this dwarf plant that is just a showstopper in spring. But it's kind of nondescript other than being a kind of a gnarly little dwarf tree the rest of the year. And so we talked about, if this had purple foliage like some other patio dwarf peaches, wouldn't it be something? And so, Denny got to work, and we've got the incredible flower power of NCSU Dwarf Double Red with burgundy foliage. So you really get this all-season display of color. And we think this is just one of the most dynamite plants out there. Won't get big. It will form some fruits. The fruits are a pit with skin over it. They are not anything that you're going to want to eat. But, if you sow them, they might give rise to some neat things. They probably will be dwarf pink flowered plants at least. So you can have fun with that. Another new introduction, and this is one I get excited about the peaches and weeping, variegated, contorted, redbud or something like that. But the nursery industry actually has to sell plants. And plants that they can sell a lot of are plants that really are useful in the landscape, not just, a weeping red leaf redbud is a statement plant. It's, but the nurserymen like it when you buy 50 of something. So dwarf, evergreen shrubs, upright plants. So I found this Juniperus virginiana, the eastern red cedar, growing beside a road down kind of the Georgia-Florida state line. I always have to go back and look at my notes to remember whether it was Georgia or Florida. But it was real silvery blue and just the most narrow, upright Atlantic white, eastern red cedar I'd ever seen. And so I took cuttings. Often these are hard to root plants. They don't root well. We had plenty of success with rooting it, planted it out, and it has just stayed narrow and silvery blue. And I was actually going to introduce it to some of the nurserymen we work with in the area. And about a month before we were going to have that meeting and I was going to show them this plant, one of the nurserymen had come out here for our Moonlight in the Garden event and sent me a note and said, "Hey, I saw this plant, silver spear. I've never heard of it. Tell me the story behind it. I think this is a great plant." And so we got all the nurserymen together. He was one of those nurserymen, and they said one of their most popular plants is Juniperus virginiana Taylor, which is a narrow, upright, very dark green eastern red cedar. So native and really a useful plant. So they're liking this silver spear quite a bit. Now, when we talk about native plants, that can mean a lot of things. Native to North America, native to the US, native to North Carolina, native to the Piedmont region, whatever. This is a southwestern plant. We call it the Mexican sugar maple or Scooch's sugar maple, Acer Scoochii. A friend of the Arboretum, Dave Creech from Texas, loves this plant. He's always given it to us. Seems like every time we see him, he's got another Scooch maple for us. Got a Scooch maple for us. You got to grow this, Mark. It's such a good plant. Say, well, we've got it, Dave. This one didn't actually come from him, but it was a bunch of seedlings that we had gotten, and we had planted them out, and we really just planted this as Acer Scoochii out in the garden. And boy, started watching it, and the new growth would come out, this bright orangey, pinky, corally color, and then go to chartreuse. It's been a slow-growing plant, hasn't gotten big fast. Acer Scoochii can get pretty large. This has been very slow-growing, but you can just see it's, the new growth comes out and it changes kind of over time. And then when it gets in summer, you get little bits of that new growth before going to chartreuse. I just love this plant. We do have it with some nurserymen. It is being produced in small numbers now, but it just takes time for these things to really get growing, especially when you start with one plant that needs to be grafted to really keep it to produce more efficiently. So slow going, but it'll be out there. And I can't wait because I don't have one of these yet, just the one at the Arboretum, and I'd really like this for the garden. Another plant that we kind of got lucky with is this Acer levigatum honglong, which means red dragon in Chinese. Collected this from a nursery plant in Shanghai, a nursery of a friend of mine there. And we had a bunch of seedlings. We gave them away and planted one. And it so happened that the one we planted has this amazing burgundy red new growth, burgundy stems. It's at its best and more in sun. We have it in shade right now, but we had moved it from a sunnier spot to shade. We've been growing it for over a decade now. Never had any problem with it. We got the seed in 2009. We planted out our first plant in 2012. We think it's awesome. Really nice oval-headed maple with these very unmaple-like leaves. It's an evergreen maple with these entire leaves. And I think I've given a whole talk on evergreen maples that is on our YouTube channel, I believe, if I remember correctly. So if you like this, you can see more. I was just at a friend of the Arboretum's garden this past week, and he was quizzing people. He's got a plant. Nobody's going to know what this is, and he showed a different evergreen maple, Acer fabri, as everybody's, walking around and looking at it going, well, it isn't a bamboo. He realized that I was in the crowd. He's like, you can't say anything, Mark. This came from the Arboretum. You can't say what it is. So I didn't get to guess. But another one that we've mentioned sometimes on this is Cornus wilsoniana, white jade. This is another one that we've been growing at the Arboretum for many, many, many years. Original plant came from Shanghai Botanic Garden. The bark on it is just spectacular. And we just grew it as Cornus wilsoniana. And it wasn't until I really started seeing this in the wild and we started collecting seed and sowing it out and looking at the seedlings that we realized we really had a superior clone. The white bark on ours is just better than any other ones I've seen. So we finally put the name White Jade on there, especially as we had been bringing in some other we were distributing seedlings from other plants, and we wanted to distinguish this superior clone from the other ones that were going out there. But it flowers really heavily. It holds its leaves until late, but then over winter has this just white bark. It's one of the best trees for winter bark interest around. Now, going old school, we were talking about the Chindo viburnum that JC introduced from his 1985 trip. Emerald pagoda styrax is one that perhaps the Arboretum is as well known for as any other plant. It's always been different than other Styrax japonicus. It's got larger leaves, it's got larger flowers. We thought it might be a tetraploid, have twice the number of chromosomes as other plants, but it winds up, it does not. The legend has it, JC was collecting plants, he had seen this, but it didn't have it had flowers on it, not ripe seed when he was there, and so he didn't collect any, and they were getting ready to get on the boat to leave Sahuksan Island, and JC said, oh, I've got to have it, and ran up the mountain and got it and raced back, and they were getting ready to leave him, and he had to leap onto the boat, and he brought the cuttings back to the Arboretum, and they wouldn't root, so they tried to graft it, and they got one to take, and then somebody dragged a hose across it and broke the graft and had to regraft it, and from that plant, all of those that are in the trade now came from that. And it really still is a phenomenal plant. JC named a couple of other styrax that never got the love that Emerald pagoda did, and mostly because they have smaller flowers and so aren't quite as showy in full bloom, but I think they're really delicate, and I think there's some room for some of these other ones out there now. Just Emerald pagoda was the one that really took off. Another plant that's been at the Arboretum since the 1950s, before it was the Arboretum. The Lagerstroemia farii collected by John Creech from the National Arboretum. He collected this. We had 5 of them growing here, and this one, Fantasy, was much more upright, really distinctly different than the really wide-spreading multi-stem you typically see. The bark is spectacular on it. Flowers are white and beautiful. It gets larger than other crepe myrtles, but boy, it is a spectacular plant. So it was here when JC got here in the 70s. It had been here for a couple decades, and I'm not sure exactly when he put the name on it, but it definitely is a different plant. And actually, I just, Sophia in our nursery told me today that we do have one of these that we're going to put in our Southeastern Plant Symposium auction. So it used to be available in nurseries. Now it's hard to come by. Now this is one that when we talk about what's our introduction, this could be our introduction or not our introduction. It's a plant we've talked about quite a bit recently because the nurserymen love it so much. But this evergreen Asian magnolia called Serendipity was actually from another nurseryman. We were growing it and it didn't have a name on it. It was just a hybrid. He didn't think much of it. And we really had to twist his arm to put a name on it. So although it wasn't from us, this would have gone nowhere. We would have had the only plant of it. It would have lived and died here as magnolia, something like 05-086, and that would have been the end of the story for it. But this is loved by our nurserymen in the area, and it's moving beyond that. They grow it as single-stemmed standards. They grow it as multi-strand shrubby trees, but it flowers for just weeks and weeks and weeks. So another kind of lucky introduction. This is one somebody found in the woods. Our native Fagus grandifolia, our native beech. Very few named cultivars of American beech. All the named cultivars are pretty much all the European beech. And a woman came to us and told us she had her neighbor had this unusual plant in their yard. So we went and saw it, and it was this weeping beech that we named White Lightning. It took us forever to figure out how to propagate it. We got it in 2011. This is actually a picture of the plant pretty much 2011, 2012. So we brought it in as a plant that was already growing, pretty well. So we immediately started trying to graft it. Nobody had any luck. We finally figured it out, but it's an amazing plant and starting to be available, but not widely yet. But it's starting to get out there in a wider way. We love it. And we love those weeping trees. This is another weeping tree. This is one that somebody found in the wild. There's two different stories that the people who tell me those stories swear are the truth. I don't want to call either one of them a liar. So this came from somewhere outside the Arboretum. This weeping winged elm, our native winged elm, called lace parasol is what JC named it, is one of the most beautiful plants. The original plant succumbed to Dutch elm disease a while back at the Arboretum, but we've got a new one planted. And this is one that you actually can propagate from cuttings. A lot of weeping plants are very difficult, but this has actually been pretty easy from cuttings. And just it's a four-season plant. It's beautiful. It's kind of this mounding green presence, but in the winter, I like it almost as much or more. And then it flowers and fruits with these early in the spring before the leaves come out. And they're little, almost teardrop shaped little fringed seed. And you come out when there's dew on it or even some frost on it. And oh my gosh, it is just breathtaking. It's one of the most beautiful things you'll see in the garden at any time of year. It just takes a little bit different type of appreciation than a hot pink dwarf double flower peach. I had to throw this in here. This is an introduction of a weird native plant that nobody knows about called Planera aquatica. It's an elm relative. It was found by Todd Lesane when he was here at the Arboretum. Planera aquatica is a really obscure tree, grows in North Carolina, South Carolina, kind of the southeast. It grows naturally in running water. That's why it's called Planera aquatica, but it is extremely drought tolerant as well. This is a plant, it's hard to even find the straight species from, specialty native plant nurseries. I had somebody in Europe begging me for seed of this, and I finally had to go out and find seed of the species to send to them. But Todd Lesane found this weeping one. We've got it planted out at the Arboretum, and it's kind of getting some more attention now because in our northeast corner where we're under a big renovation, it is the only tree that we left standing there because it was the original of this selection. And it was crowded and swallowed by other plants and vines, and we've cleaned it out, and it needs a little TLC, a little pruning, a little time to get back its beauty. Here you can see another one that was not trained into a single trunk, but is multi-trunked a tree, but has that arching weeping habit. But we're gonna get this in people's hands. I really like it. And it is the first plant I ever bought at an auction, period, full stop. But that first auction that I bought a plant at was here at the JC Raulston Arboretum back in 2004, 5, 6, somewhere in there. I was very excited about that. That and a variegated Staunthonia cartwheel. I bought those two plants at auction. Nearly ruined my marriage. Who knew that a few years later I would be moving here and being able to have access to some of these plants without breaking the bank. Now, one that sometimes we find a plant, it's just a sport on another plant. Early on, in maybe 2007 or 2008, Tim Alderton here at the Arboretum came to me and said, there is a weird sport on Stachyurus magpie, which is a terrible plant for us. It's a white variegated Stachyurus that does not grow well for us at all. And so this has a little more chartreuse in the leaf instead of that white. And we rooted a cutting and planted it out, and it grew, and it wound up being one of the best Stachyurus that you can find anywhere. Not a lot of people know Stachyurus. It flowers before people are in the nursery, so it's hard to sell from nurserymen. But I remember the first time I saw a big mature plant in flower at the U.S. National Arboretum, and I was quite literally speechless. I mean, it was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Just these long chains of yellow flowers in late winter. And the first thing I thought of is, wow, this is like a bead curtain. And then I heard Dan Hinckley talking about his garden when he was at Heronswood and doing this, getting young beeches to do this kind of elaborate framework with beeches. And I was like, oh, I'm doing this with Stachyurus. And I planted a hedge of them, but then kept them pruned in basically just 2 dimensions. It was like espalier without the wall. And right about when they started getting to where they were really great, we moved. And the person who moved in, did not appreciate the Stachyurus. That was just Stachyurus praecox. This Carolina parakeet, we named this because it was from magpie. So, kind of like you do with your prize horses and dogs and things, we kind of wanted to reference the mother. And if you look at a picture of a Carolina parakeet, they have a little bit of red on their head and then chartreuse and then green. And this, when the new leaves come out, there's just a hint of red to them and then that chartreuse and green. And the colors match almost perfectly. That was a name Tim came up with that I really liked. Since then, we found out people don't like us putting Carolina on names because they think it references UNC Chapel Hill. And, people get into basketball rivalries and things like that. So what can you do? Perhaps the plant that is most synonymous with the Arboretum is Calycanthus Raulstonii Hartlage wine. And that's because it has JC Raulston's name right in there. It's a hybrid between the Chinese Calycanthus chinensis and our native Calycanthus floridus. Calycanthus chinensis was originally Sino-Calycanthus chinensis, and so when this was introduced, it was actually Sino-Calycanthus Raulstonii. Rolls right off the tongue, but I do remember I was at Atlanta Botanic Garden when we got one of the first plants that JC parted with, and I remember some excitement around this plant. JC writes about this. That's one of the few times he felt like a rock star with everybody clamming around him was when he unveiled it to the International Dendrology Society when they visited. Richard Hartlage, former student and great landscape architect, designer, was the one who actually made the cross. And so Hartledge Wine was named for him. So when I first started the Arboretum, Denny Werner was director here, and he was just introducing his dwarf butterfly bush. And it was interesting. He introduced these dwarfs, and I asked him if he was going to keep working with them, and he said no, because just wait. They're quick. They're almost like herbaceous plants in terms of being able to do crosses and get new plants quickly. And he said the market will be saturated with these really dwarf butterfly bush. So he released them for a few years and then didn't do any more because everybody else started doing them. But he had the first truly dwarf butterfly bush, blue chip. And not only was it dwarf, the other thing that Denny was breeding for was sterility. And as he would say if he were here next to me, this is not sterile. It is functionally sterile. It has a fraction of a percent of the seed that a typical butterfly bush does. But he will not say that it was that it is actually sterile. And that's what he was going for with all of his ones. Miss Ruby, a little bit larger, but had the closest to pink, that pink-red color in a butterfly bush at the time. Both really great plants. And there was a whole series of those, lilac chip and pink chip and Miss Molly and so on and so on. And they've been great. They still sell. There are other truly dwarf ones now. There are truly dwarf ones with much bigger flower panicles. I don't know about the sterility of some of those, but that introduction from Denny and the JC Raulston Arboretum was complete breakthrough in butterfly bush plant breeding. Going to another native plant, getting into the shrubs, Viburnum obovatum, a southeastern native plant called Raulston Hardy. This, I've mentioned this before, but this was after the 2007 100-year drought we had here at the Arboretum. I started looking at the Viburnum obovatums because that was one of the toughest plants we had here. The wild plant is an ugly, ugly thing. I shouldn't say that. The wild form is wild and not very showy in a traditional sense. It is a beautiful plant because most all plants are beautiful if you appreciate them well, but you got to do a lot of appreciating to really get to the beauty of wild Viburnum obovatum. But there are several dwarf forms around, and we had one that was an unnamed form, and it wound up, we were comparing this to one that was in the trade called Ms. Schiller's Dwarf, Ms. Schiller's Delight, and it wound up that Raulston Hardy had a little bit better form, more of a dome, whereas Ms. Schiller's Delight was a little more upright, flowered a little heavier, and was more evergreen during the winter. So the nurserymen who were working with us on that suggested Raulston Hardy as the name for it, and we went with that. And they love this plant. They're growing and selling a ton of it. The only complaint is that it does sucker some. So it'll sucker around there, especially if you're doing gardening around there and digging around a plant that's growing. But that makes it perfect for where it's used a lot, which is as mass plantings. If you let this sucker and it becomes kind of this solid thing that you're not going to have weeds growing through. You don't have to keep it in a bunch of little individual buttons in the landscape. You can have it grow all together, and it just gets covered in flowers. Edgeworthia, everybody loves an Edgeworthia. That's one of those plants that it doesn't matter how many we have, we can always sell it. This is the first hybrid that I've ever heard of between the Chrysantha type and the Papyrifera type. The botanists say they're the same thing, very different in the landscape. The Papyrifera type has smaller flowers that hang down more, smaller leaves, a little bit more of a more delicate habit. Chrysantha is a little bit sturdier stems, bigger leaves, bigger flower clusters. This is we had two growing next to each other. We collected seed off the Papyrifera type. It really has it's right down the middle between those two. So not as big as Chrysantha and a little more delicate, but also showier with better flowers, better fragrance. So that's just a few of them. You know, that first slide showed, I don't know, I lost count, 80 or so plant introductions, and some of those we've gotten into the market. Some of those have not. We're always hoping that some of them will. Some of them are just different things that, you know, we put a name on it so that it doesn't get lost, but knowing that it'll probably never amount to a real landscape plant. We have a wild ginger, a serum, an Asian one that we collected, that instead of having the little flowers which are hidden under the leaves at the base that are purple throated like typical, we have this one is kind of yellow throated. They call it white. If you're in Japan, you would say it's white, but it's kind of yellow brown, and it's kind of bumpy. And if you've ever looked in the center of a serum flower, it's kind of a weird look. And so we were told we really should put a name on it just to track it for the few collectors. So we put the name Sarlacc on it, which you've got to be a Star Wars nerd to know what that is. But when you look down the throat of that flower, you get where that name comes from. And we did that just to be tongue-in-cheek. We knew it was not going to be something that was going to be sold by the thousands or the hundreds or maybe even the tens. But yeah, sometimes it's just to have a little fun with the plants.
Definitely.
And there's always more. There's lots that we're looking at and evaluating, especially now that we have our Lake Wheeler research station, research farm. But there's things in the Arboretum. Just a week ago, Tim came to me. He found another sport on a great plant that we'll be propagating and seeing how it grows. And yeah, maybe it'll show up in one of our plant sales or auctions. Probably an auction first, and then a plant sale, and then.
Cool. Well, we did have a couple of questions, Mark.
Okay.
First off, Marilyn wants to know, what are the preferred cultural requirements for Tequila Sunrise?
Oh, I thought she was going to ask me the preferred pronouns of Tequila
Sunrise.
Oh, wow, yeah. So preferred cultural conditions for Tequila Sunrise. Acer scuccii is sun-loving plant. So it is, where it grows, it is part of the dominant overstory. So it does like sun. We haven't had any problems with ours really scorching. It can kind of bleach out if it's really hot and dry. So I think it would be happier with a little bit of moisture during really dry spells, but it won't kill it. So once it's established, it seems to be pretty tough. We haven't grown it in the shade, to be honest, so it may be amazing in the shade. My guess is the color wouldn't be as good and it would go to green relatively quickly, but I'm guessing at that.
Sure. Alrighty. Jared wants to know, is Cornus wilsoniana white jade available in the trade?
It's getting there. Sure. One of the major tree liner producers, trees that, bare root trees that they sell to nurseries to pot up and grow on, has it, really likes it. They've rooted it, but they really do a lot of grafting. So we sent them a couple of years ago, we sent them a ton of seed from some of our other Cornus wilsoniana, so that they could grow out seedlings for rootstock. And then we sent them more cuttings, signwood, to graft on there. So it'll take, they'll graft those, then they'll need to grow those out so they can take cuttings, get signwood from those, to graft. And so it takes it a while to get out there because this is a wholesale place and you need, thousands of them because they're a national wholesaler. I have told them that when they're going to start selling it, that we want first dibs on it here. The nurserymen in the area are very interested in growing this, and so we're going to get as many as we can from the liner producer, and then make them available to the local nurserymen. So we get it in North Carolina first. There is Pat McCracken at Garden Treasures in Wendell, North Carolina, does grow this plant, often has it. He also grows the Acer Hong Long that I mentioned. That's another one that's in wholesale production hands, but same thing, it takes it years to get production. Mr. Maple may have it. Mr. Maple may have Tequila Sunset. They've taken cuttings on it, so MrMaple.com may have those. I'm not sure.
Awesome. Sophia wants to know, do the evergreen maples tend to have oblong leaves, and are they native only to Asia?
So the Asian evergreen maples tend to have oblong leaves and are native to Asia. The other evergreen Asian maples that have palmate foliage tend to be Mediterranean, Middle Eastern ones. They're very different. They're, usually smaller plants that are very, very drought tolerant, kind of more twiggy and coarse. So they're kind of apples and oranges, even though they're both evergreen. There you get like Acer sempervirens is one, but yeah, there are fewer of those. And in my mind, they're awesome as plants to have in a collection of maples, but with limited space, they're not ones that I would put the space in. Whereas the evergreen maples, heck yeah.
Nice.
I mean, the Asian ones I think are amazing.
Absolutely. I love the Acer fabri that's back here when it's covered in the samaras. And they stay like all season long until they're ready to run. And it's just really, really beautiful tree.
Yep.
Okay, another question from Sophia. She wants to know, does the Emerald Pagoda produce pods?
Yes, Emerald Pagoda does produce pods. Now, I don't know if JC ever did. I have never grown out seedlings from it. So I don't know if it produces good seed. I would imagine so. We don't have it seeding in the Arboretum, but with styrax, we generally don't have seeding issues with them in the garden. But every great once in a while, we'll have a year where one tree will just produce super fertile seed, and the birds don't move it or anything, but right around that tree we'll get a bunch of seedlings of it. But we also grow a lot of styrax, so that can contribute to that kind of thing.
Okay, and we had a question from Ranjani, and she wants to know what the name of the Acer palmatum in the circle outside is. She said the common name is red lace leaf Japanese maple.
Yeah, that's what we call Acer palmatum Atropurpureum dissectum group. It's not a named cultivar. It's very old. When you could get a lot of seedling Japanese maples, it was hard to come by named cultivars. It is essentially Crimson Queen, but it's an unnamed one. It's beautiful.
It is.
But I defy you to find a Japanese maple that is 40 years old that isn't beautiful.
That is fair. Honestly, yeah. Okay, well, that appears to be all the questions that are in the chat for today. So thank you so much, Mark, for pulling this together and telling us about all these plants.
Yeah, well, I always hear the ones people have questions about. I'm like, all right, we need to get some of those propagated.
Yeah.
We haven't propagated Hong Long in a while, so we need
that
to
one
do
was
that.
awesome. This winter, like the evergreen foliage, and it took on kind of like a deeper green that was bordering on like burgundy, honestly. Yeah. It was a really dynamic plant in the winter, even though it wasn't actively growing. It's like a really thumbs up from a maple enthusiast over here. Okay, and thank you everybody for joining us today on the Midweek Program. We will be back next Wednesday. Greg will be sitting down with the folks from Raleigh Stormwater to talk about all the things that gardeners can do to help benefit the environment. So that should be an absolutely wonderful presentation. So we hope we will see you all next Wednesday. Y'all take care.